Are you interested in discovering the spiritual and theological mysteries of the Old Testament, as well as exploring the current historical and archaeological evidence that supports or confounds the biblical narrative? If so, prepare to have your eyes opened as we journey to Damascus. Welcome back to St. James' production of Journey to Damascus. Last week we didn't have a production. I wasn't feeling too well, a little problem with my teeth, so we took a week off, but we're back again. We ended up the last time, Wish. Just thinking about this guy's name makes me stutter over my words. Ishbosheth was killed. He was the king of the Israelites outside of the tribe of Judah. And Abner, his commander, was killed as well. And that's where we ended up in the 4th chapter of 2 Samuel. So that's where we pick up today, the 5th chapter of 2 Samuel. So after the death of Ishbosheth and Abner, the leaders of Israel, who were not at the time being governed by King David, gather up and all come to Hebron. Hebron is probably the second most important city in all of Israel, next to Jerusalem, of course. And there's a lot of great archaeological finds going on in Hebron to this day. So all the leaders come to Hebron, where David has his administration offices for his kingship, and there they come and swear their allegiance to David, and they anoint him as king over all of Israel, well, over all the Israelites. A lot of Israel is still controlled by Canaanites, Jebusites, and Philistines, and Arameans, and all kinds of folks still in the land. But all of the tribes of Israel swear their allegiance to David. I mentioned Hebron. It was a thriving city fortification at the time of history when David was there with his monarchy. In fact, this was a powerful fortress city at least 1,500 years even before David's time. In the year 2500, we have found archaeological evidence of rock walls 20 feet thick, creating a foundation which was for obviously multiple stories of buildings located in that place. And that was during 2500, when Egypt was basically controlling that part of the Eastern Mediterranean. The biblical narrative tells us Abraham, if you'll remember, purchased property in Hebron for a burial site for his wife, Sarah. And they've excavated many burial caves in that region of Hebron. Hebron's mentioned first in Genesis, and has a strong presence in the Old Testament right through Solomon's time. David used that as his capital for 7.5 years. I have a picture here of I'm thinking it's over here. You can see it's a 4-room house that dates back to the time of David's monarchy in Hebron. This would be a typical home for the Israelites. One room generally used for sleeping, a room for storage, cooking, and living. And this was a very typical format that we could see in places all over Israel from this time period. So David was 30 years old when he became king and reigned over Judah from Hebron for that 7.5 years. And then he reigned over all of Israel for another 33 years. So David's reign was over 40 years in Israel. David was a great king, we are told. We are told the Lord was with him mightily and loved him. And when he was anointed king, King Hiram of Tyre sent greetings and pledged his support to David. And after David would eventually come into Jerusalem, which he renamed the city of David as his capital, then King Hiram sent cedar trees and carpenters and rock masons to build a palace for David in his honor. We're told that David took many more concubines and wives and had many children once he moved into that area. I want to stop here and say that it wasn't until 1993, just 27 years ago, that archaeologists found the very first evidence of David as king over all of Israel and an Israel monarchy in that time period, just 27 years ago. You gotta remember, this took place some 3,000 years ago, more, give or take. And David was king, we're told by the Bible, for over 40 years. Yet no evidence had ever been found from any corroborating sources, not from Egypt, not from Palestine, not from Jordan or Syria or anywhere around Jerusalem or anywhere around the whole region was anything ever found until just 27 years ago. At that time, an archaeologist and his team named Avraham Baran found in the city of Dan, this picture you'll see here. Let me try to get out of the way here. This is called what you're seeing here is called a stela. It is a piece of a stela. Stela was a rock monument set up in the ground for people to see. Kind of think of it as a billboard of its day. And on this stela, which is from the first temple period, which would have been about 900 BC when Solomon was king in Israel, this fragment was found in the city of Dan, and it says in the inscription, House of David, King of Israel. That is the absolute first archaeological evidence found of a monarchy of David in Israel, just 27 years ago. Much more has been found since then, but that was the first that we'd had. So right up until then, the only story we had of this David as king over all Israel was strictly from our Bible. Well, when the Philistines heard David was anointed king over all Israel, they deployed an army to the valley of Rephaim in preparation for attacking David and the armies of Israel. David went to his stronghold and prayed to God and asked God if he should attack the Philistines. And God said, you should attack the Philistines. I will deliver you. And so David and his army did attack the Philistines and routed them. But the Philistines regrouped, came back again to the valley of Rephaim. And David asked the Lord again if he should attack the Philistines, if he would be victorious. And God told him not only would he be victorious, but God gave him a military strategy for defeating the Philistines, which was part pretty smart, part kind of weird. God told him that instead of meeting them head on, that David should take his army and go around their flank and come into them from behind and wait by a large stand of mulberry trees. While waiting at the mulberry trees, God said that David should stay there until he heard the sound of marching in the tops of the trees. That's all I know about that. Maybe the sound, when they marched, came up into the mulberry trees. Maybe God just made that sound happen. I don't know. However, when David heard it, he rushed out into the attack, and David and his armies, and God's help, thrashed the Philistines, beat them badly. We're told that they chased them and defeated them from the valley of Rephaim all the way back to the city of Giza, which is 30 miles. So that was 30 miles of fighting against the Philistines, with them retreating, running, stopping, fighting, running, stopping, fighting, for 30 miles on foot, I guess with some chariots, and finally pushing the Philistines all the way back deep into their coastal areas that they controlled. So it was a great victory for David and his troops. After that, David took 30,000 of his most elite troops and took them to the house of Abinadab, where the sacred ark was. They put it on a new cart and were preparing to take it towards Jerusalem, which was being controlled at the time by the Jebusites, and they wanted to win Jerusalem and make that the new capital for David. But as they were proceeding forward with the ark, a young man, Uzzah, who was the brother to Ahiah, they were priests walking in front of and behind the cart as it traveled along the road. We're told in our biblical story, people were playing musical instruments and there was festivities and everybody was excited about the ark coming down to Jerusalem to defeat these folks. And we're told that the oxen stumbled, the ark started to tip. This young man Uzzah reached out to steady the ark, but touching the ark was an absolute no-no, and God struck Uzzah dead on the spot. Well, this grieved David greatly. David loved his Lord. I think David thought that this was extremely unfair for God to be this strict with his rules. So David thought to himself, how can I take control of the ark? I'm afraid of God at this point. I don't know what to expect from God. So he had the ark instead sent off, and he named the place where it happened Outburst Against Uzzah. Perez Uzzah, the place became known as. So David took the ark instead to the house of Obed-Edom in the city of Gath. And the ark remained there for several months, for 3 months, while David tried to figure out what his next move should be. While the ark was with Obed, David noticed that God was very good to Obed, that he had blessed him and all of his family in the time the ark was there. So eventually David kind of gets over his fear of God, and he decides it's time to go back up and to get the ark and continue on with his original plan to take the ark down into the newly acquired city of David. So they grab the ark, load it up again. They're taking it in towards the city of David, which they've now controlled. And there's a fantastic celebration. All of Israel is thrilled. David has beaten the Amorites who were in Jerusalem at the time. And there's music being played and people are celebrating as the ark's coming towards the city. And David jumps up and he is dancing and hopping and jumping all around, leading the ark as it moves forward in Jerusalem. We have a picture of that right here. You can see David. We're told that David's put on a priest's robe, and he danced and made merriment all the way into town. Well, actually, there is another interpretation of this story. Some scholars interpret what we have from the Hebrew texts as David did, yes, put on a priest's robe, but not in the manner of the last picture. As we see here, David put it on wearing it as a loincloth and danced and hopped and jumped all the way into the city of David. Now, I've got to say, I think that this is the truer of the two interpretations, because as we get to the next part of our description, we're told that Michal, David's first wife, Saul's daughter, as David's coming into the town, looks down from her window. We have a picture of this from a painting here from Tolbert. And is disgusted with what she sees from David. Now, I don't think she looks too disgusted in this picture here. So this must have been before she realized who the fool was dancing around half naked in front of the ark. But Scripture tells us that she was disgusted, embarrassed, thought that this was just a terrible thing. And but David comes marching into the town, in the city, having a great time, celebrating in front of the Lord. He is so excited about the fact that the ark has now come into the city of David that he has burnt offerings and peace offerings and blesses all the people and distributes a loaf of bread, a piece of meat, and a raisin cake to absolutely every single person in attendance there. So he's had a grand time. Unfortunately, like many men who go out and have a grand time, when he gets home, there was a price to pay. When he gets there, Michal turns to him and chides him and says, "How distinguished the king of Israel looked today, shamelessly exposing himself to the servant girls like any vulgar person might do." But David was sharp and quick and fired back and said, "I was dancing before the Lord, who chose me over your father and chose me over all of your family and appointed me leader of Israel." And he said, "And I'm willing to look even more foolish and humiliate myself for God. But as for those servant girls you mentioned, I will surely think they thought I was distinguished." We're next just told that Michal never bore children in all of her years. Must be a connection there somewhere. So, moving on. David settled in his new palace. All his most pressing enemies were at bay. And he summoned the prophet Nathan and noted that here he was living in a beautiful palace while the Ark of the Covenant, the holy place of God, resided in a mere tent. So Nathan told David that the Lord was with him, and whatever David wanted to do was okay with him. So David was making some kind of plans. We don't really know exactly what they were at this point. But that night, Nathan, while he is sleeping, he has a vision from God. And God comes to Nathan and tells him to tell David this: "Are you the one to build a house for me to live in?" And God says, "I took you from a shepherd to a leader of all Israel. I've always been with you. I have slain your enemies, and I will make your name as famous as anyone who has ever lived on earth. I will protect my people, and I will make a dynasty of you after you die, and one of your offspring will continue to rule in Israel, and he will be strong, and the country will be strong, and he will build me a house. He will build me a temple. And when he does, I will discipline him with the rod like any father, but I will always love him and never leave him. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time. Your throne is secure forever." Well, David is blown away. He is humbled by what Nathan tells him God said to him. So David, I guess, feeling a little guilty about his haughtiness, threw himself down and said a long prayer to God, which is word for word, I guess, in our text. He says a few things like, "You speak of giving your servant an everlasting dynasty. Do you deal with everyone this way, O sovereign Lord?" In David's humility and thanksgiving to God, he continues a long prayer, extolling all the things God has done for the people of God for the Israelites that he chose as his own, and gave thanks over and over for what God was doing for him and for all of his family and for all the people of Israel. Then, emboldened by this insight from Nathan about his permanence as a great leader for Israel, and the fact that he knows one of his offspring will be the next ruler of Israel, and that Israel will be a great country, and that his throne will be everlasting with God, David subdues the Philistines by conquering their greatest city, Gath. He also conquered Moab, for we're told he killed 2/3 of all the people and spared the rest as subjects who would pay tribute to him. David gets on a real rampage here. He destroys the armies of King Hadadezer of Zobah along the Euphrates River, captured 1,000 chariots, 7,000 charioteers, and 20,000 foot soldiers. When the Arameans from Damascus arrived to help King Hadadezer, David's army killed 22,000 of them and placed garrisons, Israelite garrisons in Damascus, the Aramean capital, and made them subjects to Israel and made them pay tribute. It seemed no matter where David went, no matter who he fought, he was always victorious. And all of the kings and all the cities around the region absolutely took note of that. Many of them now sent emissaries, messengers, swearing allegiance to David long before he turned his eyes towards their kingdom, and started paying tribute to him and sending him gifts of gold and silver and bronze and all kinds of goods, so that David would leave them alone. They swore allegiance to David. David defeated all that he took on, all of Israel's ancient enemies, and made them subject to Israel. And David did what was just and right for all his people who served him, we're told, which you would assume isn't just the Israelites, but once people subjugated themselves to him, he was good and honest and fair with them as well. Kind of a new thing in that part of the world, maybe in any part of the world. One day, we're told, after David had everything going his way and was feeling pretty good about things, he sought out a man who had been a servant to Saul and asked him if any of Saul's family still survived. He said that he wanted to do something to honor Jonathan, who had been such a good friend to him and who he had made a promise to take care of his family. And the man told him there was a son of Jonathan's named Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth had 2 crippled feet, was living in another man's house. So David sent for him to be brought to him. When he arrived, Mephibosheth bowed down as low as he could, showing respect for David before him. David told him not to be afraid. He intended to show him a kindness because of a promise that he had made to his father, Jonathan. He told Mephibosheth that he would give him all of the lands that his grandfather Saul had possessed. He would then instruct the servant of Saul for him and all of his 23 sons and all of their servants to take on a new job, which would be running all of these lands of Saul and farming them and making them productive for Mephibosheth. And he told Mephibosheth that he would eat at the king's table. Well, Mephibosheth didn't know what to think of it. And he asked, "How is it that I should be so honored?" And David goes on and tells him what a great man his father, Jonathan, was. So we are told that the servant did as David told him to, that the lands produced greatly for Mephibosheth, and that Mephibosheth ate regularly at David's table as though he was one of his own sons. Okay, that brings us to the 10th chapter, where we're probably going to wrap it up for today, but let me get started on that. So in the 10th chapter of 2 Samuel, it's pretty much all about David's defeat of the Ammonites, another one of those long-time dreaded enemies of the Israelites. When Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, died, his son Hanun became king. David, who had actually gotten along pretty good with Nahash, sent emissaries, messengers to Hanun to tell him how David was sorry for the loss of his father. But when they got there, Hanun's commanders said, surely David did not send these people here just for that reason. They are spies, and they're here to spy on our city and see for David to see how he can destroy us. So Hanun takes these emissaries from David. He shaves off the beard from one half of their face and leaves the other half of the beard on. And he cuts out the fabric covering their buttocks and their clothing and forces them to go back home with bare bottoms and half a beard to humiliate them and to send that humiliation to David. Well, David finds out that they're coming. Here's what the situation is. And he sends them off to a town where they should stay until their beards grow back and they can change their clothes, and so that their humiliation isn't known all over Israel. But as you imagine, David was greatly angered by this. When the Ammonites realized just how much they had angered David, they hired 33,000 mercenaries from the Arameans to bolster their troops, expecting an attack from David. Then David sent Joab, his commander, to fight them. Joab and his brother Abishai are the two commanders, and Joab comes up with a plan of how to attack the Ammonites and their mercenaries, the Arameans. Frankly, Joab's a little nervous. This is a lot of people. It's a huge army he's facing. He talks to his brother and bolsters him up and says, no matter what happens, let's be courageous and do our best for God and for our people. And then they go out and they attack. When they do, they are victorious over the Arameans, who realize that they are no match for the army of David, who is just working its way right through their ranks, and they scatter and run for the hills. When they do, the Ammonites see that from a distance, who are set up in front of their city, and they all retreat back into their protected city and close up the gates. And Joab and his brother return back to David, and they are victorious. But that's not the end of the story, as the Ammonites regroup. They contact the king of the Arameans and get more troops from the other side of the Euphrates this time, sent over to help them in battle with the Israelites again. David hears about this, about how this army is coming to him from the other direction, from the east, and led by a commander named Shobach. And when David learns about this, he mobilizes all of the troops of Israel, and he led the force himself across the Jordan River to attack the Arameans. David's force killed 700 charioteers and 40,000 foot soldiers, including the commander Shobach. The Aramean army fled. After that, we're told, the kings of the Arameans allied with David, surrendered to him, became subject to him, and started to pay tribute to him instead of their traditional allies, the other folks, the Ammonites. So at hearing about this, the Ammonites were greatly afraid. They no longer had much of any allies to help them at all, and they pretty much figured that their days were coming to an end of independence as well. Well, that's where I'm going to stop for today. The 11th chapter of 2 Samuel, if you want to read ahead, is where we are introduced to one of the most famous and infamous women and stories in the Bible, which is David and Bathsheba. You might want to freshen up on that before we go over that, so you have a little context for that. But that's a great story. Up to now, everything David has been doing has been right and wonderful and godly, but he's about to get himself in a little bit of trouble. Anyways, it's been great having you with us. Glad you're here. Hope you enjoyed our video today on 2 Samuel, and look forward to next time when we can continue on to our journey to Damascus. Goodbye. We hope you have enjoyed our discoveries for today. Please join us next time as we explore the insights of the Old Testament on the journey to Damascus.